Good afternoon, everyone. Pastor Howie here with the Thursday edition of Lectionary Thoughts. Today is Thursday, June the 17th, 2021. And we have a new psalm to look at today and tomorrow, and a next section of 1 Samuel and the history of how David came to power in Israel. And then a historical section, and in one point, kind of a hysterical section in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, dealing with Paul's journeys back to Jerusalem after his third missionary journey, and before he ends up getting arrested in Jerusalem and takes another journey to Rome. And so I'm going to start with 1 Samuel. So the passage is from 1 Samuel chapter 16, and it covers verses 14 through 23. And because I was late yesterday with this video, we've skipped a little bit, but I posted the scriptures and you can read for yourselves what's going on here. But Saul has lost favor with God because he was disobedient and started going his own way, got a little full of himself and a little empty of God. And as we find this is where Saul and David apparently first meet. This is before the incident with Goliath. But what's telling in here is how God kind of, like he did with Job, kind of opens the door and allows a bad spirit to come and afflict Saul as a disciplinary action. But the Spirit of God is still also with Saul. So here's what we find. 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. That is, he wasn't filled with the Spirit anymore. God was withdrawing his presence from him. And an evil spirit, and these are the words in the NIV, an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. So here we see kind of a picture of the Lord allowing evil spirits to afflict Saul, perhaps to bring him back. He allowed Satan himself to afflict Job. So this is not unbiblical. It's not totally unusual either. So in verse 15, Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." So this evil spirit may or may not have been actually a servant of Satan. It may have simply been a form of depression or something like that just, it's from the Lord. Not perhaps directly, but in a sense, it's from the Lord as a disciplinary action. So his attendants say, find somebody who can play music, and maybe that will help you. So Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays well and bring him to me. One of the servants answered, I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me your son David, who is with the sheep. So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. So David came as a man, not as a man after God's own heart, a young man after God's own heart. And here, in service to Saul, he became of great value. He was serving God by serving Saul and helping Saul when he got into his doldrums. When God would send that evil spirit or that spirit of evil upon him because he had departed from God. And so we get a picture that David was a person well-versed in music, well-versed in verse. And so that helps us explain how many Psalms from David do we find that are helpful to us. And that's what Psalm 9, verses 9 through 20 depicts to us. It is a Psalm of David, and the lectionary picks up at verse 9. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. See how that may connect with the way that David ministered to Saul. Those who know your name trust in you. For you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. Saul's problem was he wasn't seeking God anymore. He was seeking his own way, but God didn't totally forsake him. He sent an evil spirit or evil mood upon him, perhaps, because of that, or allowed these things to happen, perhaps in hope that he would turn back to God. But he never did, really. And so the end result was that David became king. But at this point in their life, David is a soothing minister to Saul in his depression, in his sadness, in his darkness. Sing the praises of the Lord enthroned in Zion. Proclaim among the nations what he has done. For he who avenges blood remembers, he does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. Lord, see how my enemies persecute me. Have mercy and lift me up from the gates of death. David even had his issues sometimes, but he turned to the Lord when he had those problems. That I may declare your praises in the gates of daughter Zion, and there rejoice in your salvation. The nations have fallen into the pit they have dug. And here's where I think this psalm kind of applies to us. Their feet are caught in the net they have hidden. The Lord is known by his acts of justice. The wicked are ensnared by the work of their hands. The wicked go down to the realm of the dead, all the nations that forget God. But God will never forget the needy. The hope of the afflicted will never perish. Arise, Lord. Do not let mortals triumph. Let the nations be judged in your presence. Strike them with terror, Lord. Let the nations know they are only mortal. And again, there's a picture here in those last two verses, 19 and 20, of what may have been going on with Saul. God was afflicting him with terror, perhaps, because he had done what the nations so typically do, what the people in power in the nation so typically do. They may profess to be followers of Jesus Christ, but it is so hard to stand against the flood of corruption and the flood of evil that is afflicting any nation, our nation. So we have a God we can trust and turn to when we feel afflicted. We have a God who stands for justice and would have us to stand for justice as well as witnesses of the God of righteousness and justice. We have a God of mercy who sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. And God sent people like Paul, much later than these things from the Old Testament, into the world to preach that gospel. And so we have that history of the Apostle Paul's movements and ministry in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. So he is on his way back to Jerusalem. He always went back, but back to Caesarea to give a report to the church there in Antioch. But now he's going back to Jerusalem. And so here is a history of those travels. He starts by going through Macedonia and Greece, where he planted the first church in Europe at Philippi. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people. Now, the uproar we're talking about is an uproar that happened in Ephesus, because the impact of the gospel was so great that people who were making little idols and making their living making these little idols to all of the gods that the Ephesians worshipped, especially the goddess Artemis. Were afraid they were going to, their businesses were going to fail. So they decided they'd create a civic display of displeasure. And when they couldn't get the way of the Roman governor, they caused a riot. And Paul was protected from that. But at this point in Acts chapter 20, he's on his way back to Jerusalem. So we read in verse 3 where that he stayed in Greece. He stayed 3 days, 3 months, because some Jews had plotted against him just as he was about to sail for Syria. He decided to go back through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea, where those people were the more honorable people and sought the scriptures out to see if Paul was preaching the truth, which he was. Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. So he has some traveling companions. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. So when we see that personal pronoun turning to us, then we know that Luke is also with him. But we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, which is Passover, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. That's Sunday. They met on Sunday. That's why we meet on Sunday. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. He still had a lot to preach and to teach and questions to answer. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on. And here's where there's a certain amount of sanctified hilarity in this passage. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. Now that's not hilarious, that's tragic. But the fact that Paul talked on and this poor young fellow fell asleep is kind of comical to think about. And the end result is good. The end result is not a tragedy. The end result is, in the classic sense, a comedy. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "He is alive." Then he went upstairs again, broke bread, and ate. After talking until daylight, it's like, okay, Eutychus falls down. He's supposed to be dead. Paul perhaps healed him from death, or at least found out he wasn't completely dead, and goes right back to talking. So he talked all day long until midnight, and then he talks all night long until daybreak. And you think my sermons are long. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. And then in verse 13, we went on ahead to the ship and sailed for Assos, where we were going to take Paul aboard. He had made this arrangement, because he was going there on foot. When he met us at Assos, we took him aboard and went on to Mytilene. The next day we set sail from there and arrived off Chios. The day after, we crossed over to Samos, and on the following day arrived at Miletus. Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus, spending time in the province of Asia, for he was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem, if possible, by the day of Pentecost, and that's where we leave this. But the rest of this chapter refers to the fact that he did send for the elders, who are the pastors, the bishops, to come to him from Ephesus so he could give a farewell address to them. And we may be looking at that tomorrow. I don't know. I haven't looked ahead. Anyway, the gospel is the only hope for the nations. And the Spirit of the Lord, who is with us, is our only hope when we're carrying the gospel to the people around us. May we be people who carry the gospel, who live the gospel, who show the glories of Jesus Christ in this nation where we are. Well, lots of times we think about missions and missionaries, and we give to missions, both local missions or home missions and foreign missions, but ultimately, we are all on the mission field every day of our lives, especially as our culture turns more and more away from God, as Saul turned away from God and leaves behind the Christian foundation that this country was built upon. Pray for our country. Pray for those who preach the gospel. Pray for those who are missionaries, both home and abroad. Pray for your neighbors. We'll see you tomorrow. And if you're watching on YouTube, if you like this video, hit like and subscribe. Send it to your friends, and may they be blessed as well. And we'll see you tomorrow. God bless.